geologist finds a hut in the forest, but what he sees inside shocks the entire world. Subscribe. Where are you watching us from? Write in the comments. The rhythmic thrum of the helicopter blades filled the cabin, a steady pulse that vibrated through the floor and into Marcus Hale's boots. He stared out of the small circular window at the endless expanse below, a rolling carpet of green that seemed to stretch without end, broken only by the glinting threads of rivers and the occasional jagged rise of mountains. The Siberian taiga was unlike anything he had ever seen, even after years spent working in some of the most remote regions of the planet. It was wild, untouched, and brutally indifferent to human presence. For Marcus, a man who had always sought out the edges of civilization in his work, it was thrilling and unsettling all at once. He shifted in his seat, tugging his jacket tighter around him despite the warmth inside the aircraft. The windows were fogged at the edges from the temperature difference outside. At 42, Marcus was a seasoned geologist, with sun-darkened skin that spoke of countless days spent in deserts and mountains, and eyes that carried the calm assurance of a man who had long ago made peace with solitude. He had grown up in Houston, Texas, far removed from this kind of wilderness, but he had always been drawn to the rawness of the earth, to places where human hands had not yet left their mark. Now, as part of a joint Soviet-American geological survey, he was farther from home than he had ever imagined being, and despite himself, he felt alive. He glanced across the cabin at his fellow passengers, 3 Soviet geologists bundled in heavy coats, their faces weathered and impassive, and 2 other Americans who looked far less at ease than Marcus. One of them, a younger man named Daniel, clutched the edge of his seat as if the helicopter might lurch sideways at any moment. Marcus offered him a small, wry smile, but Daniel didn't see it. His eyes were fixed on the wilderness below, as if the sheer scale of it might swallow them whole. The pilot's voice crackled over the headset, muttering something in Russian. One of the Soviets, a stocky man named Yuri, translated over the noise. "We are nearing the Abakan tributary," he said, his voice thick with an accent. "No towns here, no people, hundreds of kilometers of forest. We fly another hour, then land." Marcus nodded, his gaze sweeping across the horizon again. He had studied maps of this region, had seen the blank spaces where no surveys existed, where even satellite imagery offered only vague outlines of landforms. This was what drew him here, to these blank spots on humanity's understanding of its own planet. Beneath that endless forest lay secrets, geological formations, mineral deposits, remnants of an earth older than any memory of humankind. It was his job to study them, to pry open the hidden layers of time itself. Yet, as the helicopter dipped lower, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this land held more than just ancient stone and soil. There was an oppressive silence to it, even from above. No roads, no smoke, no signs of human habitation. It was a place frozen in time, untouched by the modern world. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging it slightly, when something unusual caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a simple break in the trees. But as they flew closer, he saw it clearly, a clearing carved into the slope of a distant mountainside. It was small, but unmistakable, a patch of bare earth amid the green expanse, bisected by dark, straight lines. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Those were furrows. Rows, evidence of cultivation. He straightened abruptly in his seat, his gloved hand tapping the glass. "Pilot," he said, pointing. "There, on the ridge. Do you see it?" The pilot glanced, squinted, and muttered sharply in Russian. The others followed his gaze, and soon there was a rush of low conversation in the cabin. Even without understanding every word, Marcus could hear the disbelief in their voices. Yuri leaned forward, peering through the window, then shot Marcus a look. "That is impossible," he said. "No one lives here. It is hundreds of kilometers to any road, any settlement. And yet—" The helicopter banked in a wide, slow circle, bringing them closer. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool glass as the clearing came into sharper view. It was no illusion. The furrows were there, long and evenly spaced, cut into the earth by a careful hand. Beside them, half concealed by the tree line, he caught a glimpse of something angular. A structure. A roof. The cabin filled with an electric tension. One of the Americans muttered, "What the hell is that doing out here?" Marcus didn't answer. His heart was pounding, a slow surge of excitement rising in his chest. This wasn't just a geological survey anymore. This was something else entirely. The pilot spoke again. His voice clipped, and Yuri translated. "He says we will mark coordinates. Tomorrow we land closer and go on foot. It is too dangerous to set down here now. Trees too thick." Marcus nodded absently, his eyes still fixed on the clearing until it slipped out of view behind them. He sat back slowly, his mind already spinning. Who could live out here, so far from any town or road? And why? As the helicopter continued its flight, the thrum of its blades filling the silence, Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine. He couldn't shake the image from his mind. The lonely patch of cultivated earth, a tiny defiance of human life carved into the heart of an endless wilderness. Whatever waited there, it had no place in the world as he knew it. And tomorrow he would see it up close. The thought both thrilled and unsettled him in equal measure. The next morning dawned gray and damp, a fine mist clinging to the treetops as the helicopter descended toward a narrow strip of land beside a winding river. Marcus sat forward in his seat, his body tense with anticipation. Sleep had eluded him for much of the night. His mind had been consumed by the image of that improbable clearing, of furrows cut into earth that should have been abandoned for centuries. Now, as the landing skids touched down and the roar of the rotors eased, he felt that strange sense of inevitability settle over him. Today, they would find out who or what was hidden in this wilderness. He stepped out into the chill morning air, his boots sinking slightly into damp soil. The taiga surrounded them in every direction, a living wall of ancient pines and larches that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. The others disembarked behind him, their movements purposeful and quiet. Yuri handed out gear, packs, ropes, and supplies for what he estimated would be a 2-day trek to reach the coordinates Marcus had marked. Marcus slung his own pack over his shoulders, the weight familiar and grounding, and looked toward the dense green wall ahead. The group set off just as the helicopter lifted away again, its engine noise fading until it was swallowed entirely by the forest. Almost immediately, the silence pressed in. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that lived deep in untouched places, broken only by the occasional rustle of branches or distant cry of unseen birds. Marcus felt the enormity of it settle over him as they pushed forward, the narrow animal trails quickly vanishing beneath the thick undergrowth. They walked single file, Marcus in the lead, his compass and map in hand. The terrain was relentless. Ancient roots coiled like serpents underfoot, ready to trip the unwary. Fallen logs forced them to climb or detour. Small streams, icy and fast-moving, cut across their path, soaking their boots to the ankle. The smell of wet earth and pine needles clung to the air, mingling with the sharp tang of their sweat. By midday, the forest canopy had thickened so much that it muted the daylight, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. Marcus could feel the weight of it, the knowledge that beyond these trees there were no roads, no villages, not even a hunter's cabin. The deeper they went, the more the world they had left behind seemed like a distant memory. Daniel, lagging behind, muttered something under his breath. Marcus slowed just enough to glance back at him. The younger man's face was pale and slick with sweat. "How much further?" he asked, his voice betraying unease. Marcus didn't sugarcoat it. "We've got a ways yet. We'll make camp tonight, keep going in the morning." Daniel groaned but trudged on. The Soviets, by contrast, were stoic and silent, their faces betraying neither discomfort nor fatigue. Yuri occasionally paused to check bearings against Marcus's notes, but otherwise they pressed forward with the steady determination of men accustomed to hardship. As the sun dipped low, though it was scarcely visible beneath the canopy, Marcus called for a halt in a small clearing near a creek. They pitched tents quickly and lit a fire that sputtered in the damp air but eventually caught. As they sat around the flames, sharing a meager meal of dried meat and bread, Marcus felt that same unshakable curiosity gnaw at him. They were closer now, only a day's trek from the clearing, and the mystery of it seemed almost palpable, like static humming in the air around them. The night was long. The fire burned low, and the sounds of the forest grew louder in its absence. Somewhere in the darkness an owl hooted. Branches creaked under the weight of unseen creatures. Marcus lay in his tent, staring at the fabric above him, his mind wandering again to the structure they had glimpsed from the air. Who would choose to live here? Was it even a choice, or had they been forced into exile? He dreamed in fragments when sleep finally claimed him. Visions of a cabin hidden in shadows, faces half seen behind windows, whispers he could almost understand but not quite. When dawn came, it was with a gray light that seeped reluctantly through the misty canopy, pulling him from uneasy rest. They broke camp quickly, ate in silence, and set off again. The terrain grew harsher. Hills rose steeply, demanding careful footing as they climbed. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees older, thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled with age. They found traces of wildlife, fresh tracks of elk, the sharp print of a wolf, but no sign of human passage. By midday, they reached a narrow ridge and paused to rest. From here, through a gap in the trees, Marcus caught his first glimpse of the distant slope where the clearing lay. His heart leapt. Even from this far, he could make out the faint geometry of it, the unnatural symmetry of rows cut into wild land. Yuri followed his gaze and gave a low whistle. "You see, it is no hunter's camp," he said. "This is something else." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on that distant patch of earth. It felt like staring through time itself, like glimpsing a fragment of history that had no business existing in the present. He could feel the tension in the group sharpen. Even Daniel seemed to sense it, his complaints forgotten as they resumed their descent into a narrow valley below. The final stretch was the hardest. The ground was soft and treacherous, marshy in places where hidden springs bubbled beneath the moss. Insects rose in clouds whenever they disturbed the undergrowth, biting relentlessly. The smell of wet vegetation clung to them heavy and pungent, but none of it mattered. They were close now. So close, Marcus could almost feel the presence of whoever had carved that clearing out of the wilderness. By late afternoon, the sun a dim ghost behind the mist, they reached a small rise overlooking a shallow ravine. Beyond it lay the slope they had seen from above. Marcus crouched low, motioning for the others to do the same. Through the branches ahead, he saw it clearly now. The clearing, just as before. The furrows of cultivated earth. The outline of a cabin, rough-hewn and ancient, its roof dark with age, and faintly, almost imperceptibly, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. His breath caught in his chest. This was no abandoned site. Someone was there. The others stared in silence, their faces tense, eyes wide. Daniel whispered, "Jesus Christ, there really is someone." Marcus felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and unease. The mystery that had driven him here was suddenly tangible, a living thing in front of him. The cabin was no longer just an anomaly glimpsed from the air. It was real, inhabited, its presence defying reason in this untouched wilderness. He turned to the group, and his voice low but steady. "We make camp here," he said. "Tomorrow we go in." That night, as they huddled in the shadow of the ridge, sleep was even harder to come by. The smoke from the cabin's chimney was still visible in the fading light, proof that less than a kilometer away, someone was living a life untouched by the modern world. Marcus lay awake long after the others had drifted into uneasy rest, staring through the trees towards that impossible dwelling, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Tomorrow they would knock on its door. The dawn was slow to arrive, hidden behind thick banks of mist that clung to the treetops and rolled down the slopes like a living thing. Marcus rose before the others, sitting silently at the edge of the camp, his boots damp from the night air. He watched the clearing through the pale haze, the outline of the cabin barely visible between the trees. The thin wisp of smoke that curled from its chimney was steady, proof of life. He felt his chest tighten with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Today, they would no longer be silent observers. Today, they would cross that last stretch of wilderness and step into whatever forgotten world waited inside those wooden walls. The others stirred one by one, wordless as they packed their gear. The usual chatter of field work was gone, replaced by a quiet focus, as if each man understood instinctively the significance of what they were about to do. Daniel glanced repeatedly toward the clearing, his expression tense, while Yuri moved with steady purpose, checking his rifle, though Marcus doubted there would be need for it. Marcus himself said nothing. He could feel the gravity of this moment, as though they were about to breach a barrier not just of distance, but of time itself. When they set out, the forest swallowed them whole, muffling the sound of their footsteps as they wound their way down the ridge. The ground was soft underfoot, the smell of wet moss thick in the cool air. Birds stirred overhead, startled by their presence, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus heard the faint cry of an unseen animal. The closer they drew to the clearing, the sharper his senses became. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow deeper, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. At last, they reached the edge of the trees. The clearing stretched before them, exactly as they had seen it from above. A patch of cultivated earth carved out of the wilderness. Neat rows of soil planted with what Marcus guessed were potatoes and hardy vegetables suited to the harsh climate. He crouched low, scanning for signs of movement. The cabin sat at the far end, small and rough-hewn, its logs weathered to a deep gray by decades of wind and snow. Smoke still drifted lazily from the chimney. Marcus motioned for the group to follow as he stepped out into the open. The air felt heavier here, as if even the birds had gone quiet. He could feel his pulse in his ears as they crossed the clearing, their boots sinking slightly into the damp earth of the furrows. The soil was freshly turned. Someone had been working here recently. When they reached the cabin, Marcus stopped in front of the door. It was old and uneven, built from rough planks fastened with hand-forged nails, the kind of craftsmanship that hadn't been common in generations. He raised a gloved hand and knocked gently. For a moment, there was nothing. The forest seemed to press in around them, silence hanging thick and suffocating. Then, from within, came a faint rustling sound. Footsteps. The door creaked open a fraction and a face appeared in the gap. A man, gaunt and weathered, his hair long and streaked with gray, his beard full and wild. His eyes, sharp and wary, fixed on Marcus with an intensity that rooted him to the spot. The man said nothing at first, only studied them as though he were looking at creatures from another world. Marcus took a slow breath, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "We're not here to hurt you," Marcus said gently, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We just want to talk." The man blinked, his gaze sweeping over Marcus and the others, then shifted slightly. Marcus caught sight of movement behind him. More faces appeared in the shadows, a woman, her hair wrapped in a faded kerchief, and 3 younger figures, 2 young women and a man, all with the same hollow-cheeked look, their clothes little more than rough-spun garments pieced together from burlap and animal skins. Their eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and something else Marcus couldn't quite place. Wonder. Yuri stepped forward, speaking in Russian, his tone calm and measured. The older man's eyes flickered at the sound of the language, and after a long moment, he responded in a voice that was hoarse from disuse. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but Yuri translated in a low voice. He says his name is Pyotr. He wants to know who we are, why we are here. Marcus nodded slowly. Tell him we're geologists. We were surveying the area from the air when we saw his clearing. We didn't know anyone lived here. Yuri relayed the words. Pyotr's brow furrowed, his expression wary but less hostile. He glanced back at the woman, his wife, Marcus guessed, who stood holding the hand of one of the young women as though ready to pull her back if needed. Then, after a moment's pause, he opened the door wider and gestured for them to enter. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the glow of a small hearth where a pot hung suspended over the fire. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and earth, of dried herbs hanging in bunches from the rafters. It was primitive, almost medieval. A dirt floor packed hard, walls lined with crude shelves holding clay pots and wooden bowls, and a single table at the center, worn smooth by years of use. The family gathered near the hearth, watching the strangers with silent intensity. Marcus removed his gloves and crouched slightly, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. The younger children, though they were nearly adults, stared at him as if he were something unreal. One of the girls whispered something to her brother, who shook his head quickly. Their speech was strange, their Russian thick with an archaic lilt even Marcus could hear despite not knowing the language. Yuri continued speaking with Pyotr, translating for the group. They came here many years ago, Yuri said quietly. He says they have been here since before the war. Marcus blinked. The Second World War? Yuri nodded gravely. Yes, he says they fled. They have not left since. Marcus felt the weight of those words settle over him. He looked at the family again, at their handmade clothes, their lean faces, their wary eyes. They had been cut off from the world for over 40 years. No roads, no electricity, no contact with civilization of any kind. It was as if time itself had stopped for them. He noticed their hands, calloused, rough from labor, and the tools propped near the hearth. Simple wooden handles, metal blades blackened from years of use. Everything about them spoke of survival in its purest form. The young man stepped forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Marcus. He said something, his tone hesitant but curious. Yuri listened, then smiled faintly. He asks, "If you came from the sky?" Marcus couldn't help but chuckle softly. "In a way," he said, nodding toward where the helicopter had landed miles away. "Yes, we did." The answer drew quiet murmurs from the family, their eyes widening. Marcus felt an almost overwhelming sense of displacement, standing there in that dim cabin surrounded by people who had lived their entire lives without knowing the world beyond these trees. It was like standing on the threshold of two different centuries. As the fire crackled and the scent of wood smoke hung thick in the air, Marcus realized that their discovery was far more than he had anticipated. This was no simple anomaly on a map, no forgotten hunter's camp. It was a living fragment of the past, breathing and real before his eyes. And he could not shake the feeling that, in crossing that threshold, they had stepped into a story that would change all of them forever. Marcus sat on a rough wooden stool near the cabin's central hearth, the flickering fire casting long shadows across the dirt floor. The smell of wood smoke and boiled roots hung thick in the air. His notebook rested in his lap, though for a long while he didn't write anything. He could only look around, taking in the strangeness of it all. Everything about this place felt like stepping through a crack in time. The walls were built from hand-hewn logs, their gaps stuffed with moss for insulation. The single window was little more than an opening covered by a translucent animal hide stretched tight. In the far corner stood a small wooden loom, half-finished cloth draped over it. Bundles of dried herbs dangled from the rafters, rustling faintly whenever the wind squeezed through the seams in the walls. The family sat clustered together near the fire, as if their closeness could shield them from the intrusion of these strangers. Pyotr, the father, was still cautious, though less tense than when they had first arrived. His wife, whom Yuri translated as named Galina, sat beside him, her thin hands folded tightly in her lap. Their children, Mikhail, the son, and the two daughters, Anya and Vera, hovered close, their wide-eyed gazes flickering between Marcus and the others. Marcus noticed how they watched every detail: the fabric of his coat, the zipper on his pack, even the small flashlight clipped to his belt. They were fascinated and wary all at once, as though they were staring at something half-mythical. Yuri spoke slowly in Russian, his voice soft, coaxing. He had been gently leading Pyotr through his memories for over an hour, translating in pieces so that Marcus and the other Americans could follow. At first, the old man's words were halting, as if his tongue had grown stiff from years of disuse in conversation with outsiders. But gradually, as the fire burned lower and the cabin filled with its warmth, his story began to unfold. They had come here in 1941. Pyotr's father had been a devout man, deeply religious at a time when faith could mean persecution. He had feared for his family as rumors spread of arrests in nearby villages, neighbors taken away in the night. When soldiers came through their region, Pyotr's father gathered his wife and children and fled, carrying only what they could strap to their backs. They walked deep into the wilderness, away from roads, away from settlements, until there was no one left to follow them. They built their first shelter out of branches and bark, barely surviving the first winter. Over time, they learned to hunt, to trap, to till the soil in the thin pockets of earth between the rocks. "We made our home here," Yuri translated softly, his voice tinged with something almost reverent. He says they swore never to return, never to risk being found. They believed the world outside had turned against them. Marcus glanced at the children. Mikhail was in his 20s, his frame lean and wiry from years of labor. Anya and Vera were younger, perhaps late teens, both shy and silent, their hair long and unkempt. They had been born here, in this cabin. They had never seen a car, never heard a radio, never even imagined something like the helicopter that had carried Marcus over the forest. "Do they know," Marcus asked quietly, "what happened in the world? About the war? About everything since?" Yuri asked the question. Pyotr's brows knitted, and he replied with a slow shake of his head. His voice was low, almost resigned, and Yuri translated. "He says they know nothing of it. His father forbade talk of the outside. After he died, they stayed. They feared the world had only grown worse." Galina spoke then, her voice so soft Marcus almost missed it over the crackle of the fire. Her words carried a weary sorrow even before Yuri translated. "She says they heard strange noises in the sky sometimes, airplanes, but they stayed hidden. They saw no one. They dared not." Marcus sat back, the weight of it pressing down on him. 40 years. For 4 decades, they had lived here in complete isolation, surviving on what they could grow, hunt, or make with their hands. He thought of his own childhood in Houston, of bustling streets, electric lights, television, supermarkets. For these people, that might as well have been another planet. He noticed their tools again, axes blackened with age, knives sharpened so many times they had worn to thin slivers of metal. Their clothes were patched so often they were nearly unrecognizable as fabric. Their feet were wrapped in strips of leather in place of shoes. Even their language sounded different. Their words thick with archaic inflections that Yuri said hadn't been used in decades. Mikhail, boldest of the children, leaned forward slightly. He asked something that made his sisters glance nervously at their father. Yuri listened, then hesitated before translating. He wants to know if the world is still dangerous, if men still take families away. Marcus hesitated. He thought of how to answer. How could he explain history, politics, decades of change to someone whose entire life was bound within these walls? He finally spoke, choosing his words carefully. "No, the world is not like that anymore. You don't have to hide." Yuri relayed his answer. Mikhail's face was unreadable, a mix of hope and confusion. Pyotr frowned, looking away toward the fire as if weighing Marcus's words against a lifetime of fear. Anya reached up, touching a small carved icon that hung on the wall beside her. Marcus realized it was a religious figure, hand-chiseled from wood and worn smooth by decades of fingers passing over it. Their faith had sustained them here, he thought, in this place where nothing else existed but trees, sky, and silence. "Ask them," Marcus said quietly to Yuri, "how they survived the winters." Pyotr's answer came quickly this time. They had learned through hardship. They trapped sable and hare for fur, hunted elk and wild boar. They smoked meat to last through the long months of snow. They dug a root cellar beneath the floor to keep what little they harvested. In the summers, they foraged for berries, mushrooms, and edible plants. Over the years, they had built up a routine so ingrained it had become their entire existence. They did not think beyond it because there had never been anything else. Galina added something then, her voice trembling slightly. Yuri translated, his voice subdued. "She says they buried 2 children out there, beyond the clearing. The winters were not always kind." Silence fell heavy over the cabin. Marcus stared into the fire, its glow blurring in his vision. This family had endured unimaginable hardship to remain unseen, clinging to a way of life that belonged to another century. And yet, here they were, alive, breathing, real. Marcus pulled his notebook closer and began to write, capturing every detail. Their words, their faces, the way the daughters clung to each other when anyone moved too suddenly, the way Mikhail's eyes darted toward him with unspoken questions. He realized that what they had stumbled upon was more than an anomaly. It was living history. As the night deepened, Pyotr's voice grew softer, his eyelids heavy. The family huddled close together as though it were instinct, their bond forged not just by blood, but by years of shared survival against a world they believed had abandoned them. Marcus closed his notebook slowly, the scratching of his pen ceasing. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin walls. Marcus sat in silence, watching them, and felt a profound weight settle over him. He had come here searching for rocks, for the remnants of the Earth's past. Instead, he had found something far more astonishing. A family who had carved their own existence out of time itself, living proof of how faith and fear could seal people away from the world for a lifetime. He knew then that nothing he had seen before, in all his travels to deserts, mountains, and distant lands, compared to this. And he wondered, with a chill that ran through him as he stared at the slumbering figures by the firelight, what would happen when this world finally collided with theirs. Marcus awoke to the faint smell of smoke still lingering in the cabin and the muted sounds of movement nearby. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented, until he remembered where he was. The light filtering through the single window was pale and cold, the kind of light that came from a sun obscured by clouds and mist. He sat up slowly, his muscles stiff from the hard floor and the thin bedroll he'd used. Across the room, he saw Galena crouched near the hearth, stirring something in the pot that hung above the glowing embers. Her children were awake too, busying themselves with quiet, practiced movements, one fetching water from a bucket, another checking the bundles of herbs that hung from the rafters. It struck Marcus again how seamlessly they moved together, like parts of a single well-oiled mechanism built by years of repetition. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Each of them knew exactly what to do, and they did it in silence, communicating with brief glances rather than words. He realized then that they had lived this way for so long that it was not simply survival, it was their life, their rhythm, their identity. When Pyotr stirred from sleep and rose from his spot near the hearth, Marcus met his gaze. The older man's eyes were clear, steady, and guarded. He looked at Marcus as if still weighing the strangers who had entered his sanctuary. Marcus offered a polite nod, but inside he felt the growing weight of what they had stumbled upon. After a simple breakfast of boiled roots and thin slices of smoked meat that tasted of pine and wood smoke, Yuri resumed speaking with Pyotr. Marcus listened carefully as the translation came, his thoughts turning over each word. Pyotr had not wavered in his conviction that this forest was their home and their sanctuary, that the world beyond was dangerous, corrupt, and alien. It was clear that, for him, stepping outside this boundary would mean betraying not only his own past but also the generations who had endured here before him. Yet, Marcus could see the flicker of doubt in the children, especially in Mikhail. The young man had asked the most questions, his eyes lighting up with curiosity whenever Marcus or Daniel mentioned even the simplest things about the outside world. He wanted to know what a car was like, what a city looked like, what it meant to see lights at night brighter than any fire. His sisters were quieter, but their glances toward Marcus and the others were filled with wonder and hesitation, as though they stood on the edge of some precipice they had never imagined. Marcus stepped outside with Yuri, breathing in the sharp air and glancing back toward the cabin where the family worked. He spoke in a low voice. "We can't just leave them here. They don't even know what's out there. They don't understand that they don't have to live like this anymore. Yuri exhaled, rubbing his gloved hands together. "It's not so simple," he replied. "Pyotr is stubborn. His whole life has been built on the belief that staying hidden was the only way to keep his family safe. To him, we are dangerous not because of what we might do, but because we are proof that his world is not the only one." Marcus frowned, watching as Mikhail stepped out of the cabin carrying a crude axe to chop wood. The young man's movements were strong and sure, but there was a restless energy in him that Marcus recognized. He saw himself in Mikhail, the same hunger for something beyond what he had always known. When Mikhail noticed Marcus watching, he paused, then approached. He asked something in halting words, his voice tentative. Yuri listened, then translated with a slight smile. "He asks if he could see the machine that flies in the sky again." Marcus crouched slightly, meeting Mikhail's gaze. "You mean the helicopter?" he asked, gesturing upward. Mikhail nodded eagerly. "Yes," Marcus said slowly, knowing Yuri would translate. "I can show it to you, but it is far from here. We would have to walk." Mikhail's eyes brightened, but before he could respond, Pyotr's voice rang out sharply from behind. The old man had stepped out of the cabin, his expression stern and commanding. He spoke quickly, his words carrying the weight of authority. Mikhail's shoulders sagged, and he nodded reluctantly before returning to his task. Galina appeared in the doorway, her face lined with worry. She clutched her shawl tighter around her and murmured something to Pyotr, who responded with a low, calming tone. Marcus watched them, sensing the tension that hummed beneath the surface. This was more than mere caution. It was fear born of a lifetime of believing the outside world would only bring ruin. As the day wore on, Marcus spent more time speaking with Yuri about how they might help. The other Americans mostly kept to themselves, unsettled by the depth of what they had encountered. Daniel, usually talkative, had grown quiet, his gaze lingering on the family with a mix of pity and unease. That evening, Marcus sat with Mikhail by the fire while Yuri translated between them. He told the young man about electric lights, trains, ships larger than villages, and cities that glittered with glass towers. He described airplanes soaring across the sky and music that could be heard without a musician playing before you. Mikhail listened intently, his eyes wide, his expression torn between awe and disbelief. Anya and Vera drew closer too, silent but rapt, hanging on every word. Pyotr watched from across the room, his jaw tight, his hands clenched around his knees. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. Yuri translated reluctantly. He says that such things are temptations. He says they only lead people away from what is good, what is simple. He says the world out there is full of cruelty, and that it was better they stayed here where God and the forest kept them alive. Marcus felt the weight of those words, but he could not ignore what he saw in the eyes of Pyotr's children. They wanted more. They wanted to know. He met Pyotr's gaze and spoke gently but clearly. The world is not what you think it is anymore. Whatever dangers there were, they are gone. Your children deserve to see more than these walls. Yuri translated, and the old man's face darkened. For a moment, Marcus thought he might order them out altogether. But instead, Pyotr turned away, staring into the fire. He said nothing more. That night, Marcus lay awake, listening to the wind groaning through the trees and the soft breathing of the family huddled together near the hearth. He thought of the long years they had spent here, of the lives they had lost in these woods, of the children who had never known anything beyond this clearing. He wondered what right he had to intervene in their lives. Would helping them mean saving them, or destroying the fragile, self-contained world that had sustained them for generations. He rolled onto his side and stared at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. Tomorrow, he told himself, they would have to decide. Whether they left this family as they were or convinced them to step beyond these trees for the first time in 40 years, the choice would change everything, for the family and for him. The morning came with a hushed stillness, the kind that seemed to hold the forest in suspense. Marcus awoke to the pale light seeping through the animal hide window, the chill of the cabin biting at his skin even beneath his layers. For a long moment, he remained still, listening to the faint crackle of embers in the hearth and the soft sounds of movement from the family. Galena was already awake, her hands deftly folding worn fabric, while Anya knelt beside her, braiding her younger sister's hair with slow, careful motions. Mikhail sat near the doorway, his axe resting against the wall beside him, his eyes distant, as though his thoughts were far beyond this room. Pyotr was seated at the table, staring at nothing in particular, his weathered hands folded tightly before him. Marcus could see it plainly. He had not slept well. The lines on his face looked deeper, his shoulders heavier. As Marcus rose quietly and stepped closer, the old man looked up, his expression guarded but not hostile. There was a silence between them that seemed to stretch until Yuri entered and broke it with a low greeting. They ate breakfast in silence, a meager meal of boiled roots and dried fish. The tension was palpable, each of them aware that the decision they had danced around since their arrival could no longer be avoided. After the meal, Pyotr rose and motioned for Yuri and Marcus to follow him outside. The air was sharp and damp, the mist still clinging to the trees at the edge of the clearing. Pyotr walked slowly, his steps deliberate, until they reached a spot where the forest gave way to a small rise overlooking the slope below. He paused there, looking out over the endless sweep of trees, his breath curling in the cold air. For a long while he said nothing, and then he began to speak in slow, measured Russian. Yuri translated softly. He says he has thought long on your words. He knows his children look at you and dream of what lies beyond these woods. He does not wish to see them torn away as his father once feared, but he knows they are not children anymore. He cannot keep them chained to this place forever. Marcus listened, his heart pounding. He glanced at Pyotr, reading the conflict in the man's eyes. The fierce love of a father who had given his life to protect his family, and the dawning realization that his protection had become a prison. Galena joined them then, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her face drawn with worry. Behind her came the children, drawn by curiosity or perhaps by the same sense of inevitability Marcus felt. They gathered in a small circle, and Pyotr looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering longest on Mikhail. The young man shifted uneasily but did not look away. His voice, when it came, was steady. He spoke directly to his father, and Yuri translated almost at once. He says he loves this place, but he wants to see what lies beyond it. He wants to know if there is more than these woods. He says he does not fear the outside world as his father does. Galena's face tightened with distress, but she said nothing. Anya reached for her mother's hand, while Vera looked between her brothers, silent but wide-eyed. Pyotr closed his eyes briefly, the lines of his face deepening. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, tinged with resignation. Yuri's words came softly. He says that if Mikhail wishes to go, he will not stop him. He says he himself will stay. This is his home, his grave when the time comes. He cannot leave what he has built here. The silence that followed felt immense. Marcus saw Mikhail's jaw tighten, a mixture of excitement and sorrow flashing across his face. He turned to his sisters, who clutched each other tightly, and spoke again. Yuri hesitated, then translated. He asks if they will come too. Anya and Vera exchanged a glance, their expressions conflicted. Anya looked down, shaking her head faintly. She says she cannot, Yuri explained. She says her place is here, with her mother and father. Vera is the same. They are afraid. Mikhail stood straighter, his hands curling into fists. He looked at Marcus then, as if seeking some kind of affirmation, and Marcus felt a deep ache in his chest. Here was a young man standing at the precipice of his entire world, ready to step off into something utterly unknown. Yuri spoke once more, his voice carrying the gravity of finality. It is decided. Mikhail will go with us. The rest will stay. Galina's eyes welled with tears as she stepped forward and embraced her son, holding him tightly as if she could memorize the feel of him in that single moment. Pyotr placed a hand on Mikhail's shoulder, his grip firm but trembling slightly. Words passed between them, few but heavy, spoken in a tone Marcus instinctively recognized as both blessing and warning. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Mikhail packed what little he owned, a small knife, a few pieces of clothing, a wooden carving that had likely belonged to his grandfather. His sisters clung to him as he worked, tears silent on their faces. Galina moved about the cabin, her movements mechanical, while Pyotr sat near the hearth sharpening his old hunting knife, not speaking but watching. As dusk fell, they gathered one last time inside the cabin. The firelight flickered across their faces, throwing shadows on the walls. Mikhail sat between his parents, holding their hands, while Marcus and the others remained respectfully apart, aware of the intimacy of the moment. Yuri translated in low tones as Pyotr spoke quietly to his son, passing down what Marcus could only guess were words of guidance, survival, and love born of a lifetime in this wilderness. When night came fully, Marcus stepped outside, giving them their privacy. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, the forest silent but alive with unseen movement. He looked up at the sky, at the stars that stretched across it in brilliant clarity unspoiled by any artificial light, and felt a strange mix of awe and melancholy. Tomorrow they would leave this place, taking Mikhail with them. The rest of the family would remain, bound by fear, loyalty, and a way of life that had become all they knew. Marcus wondered how it would feel for Mikhail to see the world beyond these trees, to hear the roar of engines, to stand in a place where the sky was streaked not with smoke from a hearth, but with lights from 100 windows. And he wondered, too, if, in helping him take that step, they were saving him, or forever breaking a piece of the world that had survived untouched against all odds. He turned back toward the cabin, where the soft glow of firelight spilled faintly from the cracks in the walls. Tomorrow, everything would change, for Mikhail, for this family, and perhaps even for Marcus himself. The morning of their departure was gray and silent, as if the forest itself understood what was happening and had fallen into a solemn hush. Marcus rose early, stepping outside to find Mikhail already awake, standing alone at the edge of the clearing. He was staring into the distance, where the tree line dissolved into mist and shadow, his shoulders squared but rigid. Marcus approached slowly, his boots crunching faintly against the damp earth. When Mikhail turned to face him, his expression was taut, his jaw clenched, but in his eyes there was a glimmer of something electric, an unspoken anticipation mingled with fear. The family emerged one by one from the cabin. Galena clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her face pale and lined with worry. Anya and Vera hovered close to her sides, their hands intertwined as though anchoring themselves to one another. Pyotr followed last, his broad frame filling the doorway, his gaze fixed firmly on his son. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was heavy with the weight of words that could never be enough. Mikhail stepped forward and embraced his mother first. Galena's arms wrapped around him fiercely, her fingers trembling against his back. She whispered something into his ear that Marcus could not hear, but whatever it was caused Mikhail's face to twist, his eyes brightening with unshed tears. He kissed her cheek and turned then to his sisters, pulling them into a single, lingering hug. They clung to him desperately, their shoulders shaking as they pressed their faces against his chest, as if memorizing him, afraid that letting go might mean losing him forever. Finally, he faced his father. Pyotr's eyes were steady, but carried a depth Marcus could scarcely imagine, the look of a man watching his son step into a world he had fought so hard to shield him from. He placed his hands firmly on Mikhail's shoulders and spoke in a low, deliberate voice. Yuri translated softly. He says, "You are my son. You will carry our name beyond these woods. Remember who you are. Remember where you come from." Mikhail nodded, swallowing hard. He replied in a quiet tone, his voice strained. "I will come back," Yuri translated. "One day I will return." The old man's hands lingered on his son's shoulders for another moment, then slowly fell away. Pyotr stepped back, and without another word, Mikhail picked up the small bundle of belongings he had prepared the night before. A knife, some clothing, and a carved wooden figure his grandfather had made decades ago. His entire life fit neatly into that single cloth sack. Marcus gestured toward the path that would lead them back through the forest. The group began to move, their footsteps muffled against the soft ground. Mikhail paused at the edge of the clearing and turned back one last time. His family stood clustered near the cabin, their faces pale against the dark logs of the home that had been their world. Galena raised a trembling hand in farewell, and Mikhail lifted his own in response. It was a silent moment, held in the mist and the stillness of the taiga, before he turned away and followed Marcus into the trees. The journey back was grueling, but different from before. Where there had been tense curiosity on the way in, now there was an undercurrent of urgency, a sense of inevitability. Mikhail followed closely, his eyes wide as he took in the forest around him in a way he never had before. The sounds that had always been background noise to him, the rustle of branches, the distant call of birds, seemed sharper now, as though he were already becoming an outsider to the only world he had ever known. He asked questions as they walked, his voice quiet but eager. He wanted to know how far it was to the machine that could fly, what it would feel like to rise above the trees, what lay beyond the endless green horizon he had stared at his whole life. By the time they reached their camp from the previous nights, the mist had burned away, and a pale sun filtered through the canopy. They rested briefly before pressing on, crossing streams and climbing steep ridges until the trees began to thin and the distant hum of rotors echoed faintly in the still air. Mikhail froze at the sound, his head tilting upward, his face stricken with awe and disbelief. When the helicopter finally came into view, resting on a patch of rocky ground where it had been left waiting, Mikhail stopped in his tracks. His breath caught audibly. The machine gleamed faintly in the weak light, its form alien against the wild backdrop of the taiga. Marcus watched as Mikhail's lips parted in wonder, his grip tightening on the bundle he carried. He stepped forward hesitantly, circling the helicopter, his fingers reaching out to touch its cold metal skin. His reflection stared back at him in its glass windows, distorted and unfamiliar. "It flies?" Mikhail asked softly in his thick accent, and Marcus smiled. "Yes," he said, "and you'll be inside it." The boy's eyes widened further, but he nodded. He climbed aboard with careful, tentative steps, ducking his head as he entered the cabin. His hands clutched the straps of the seat as Marcus guided him in. When the engine roared to life, Mikhail jolted but did not cry out. Instead, he stared out the window, his face illuminated with astonishment. As the helicopter rose from the ground, lifting above the trees, Mikhail's breath hitched sharply. The cabin filled with the rhythmic thrum of the blades, and the forest that had defined his entire life dropped away beneath him. His fingers pressed hard against the glass as he stared down at the unending ocean of green. His village, now nothing more than a faint dot hidden among it. He whispered something in Russian, and Yuri leaned closer to hear. "He says," Yuri translated with a faint smile, "I never knew the sky was so big." Marcus felt a pang in his chest at those words. He turned his gaze downward as well, watching the wilderness recede, knowing that for Mikhail, this was more than just a first flight. It was the shattering of an entire reality and the birth of a new one. When they reached the nearest settlement, hours later, Mikhail stepped out onto solid ground that was nothing like the soil of his clearing. Gravel crunched beneath his feet. Strange buildings loomed nearby and vehicles rumbled past, belching exhaust into the cold air. The noise was overwhelming. Mikhail froze, his head darting in every direction, his eyes wide and almost frightened. Marcus placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The days that followed were a blur. News of their discovery spread faster than Marcus could comprehend. The story of a family living in isolation for over 40 years captured the imagination of the world, flooding newspapers and broadcasts with headlines. Marcus watched as the journalists descended on the settlement, their cameras flashing, their questions relentless. He shielded Mikhail as best he could, guiding him through the sudden onslaught of a civilization he had never imagined. Through it all, Mikhail stayed close to Marcus, his anchor in a sea of overwhelming change. The young man's wonder was palpable. Electric lights that banished darkness with a flick of a switch, hot water flowing from taps, food that appeared not from soil or smoke, but from brightly lit shops stocked with colors and smells he had no names for. Yet, beneath the awe, Marcus saw the flicker of unease, the way loud noises made him flinch, how crowds left him tense and wary. One evening, as Marcus sat with him outside a quiet building on the edge of town, Mikhail spoke softly, his voice carrying both wonder and longing. Yuri translated gently. "He says it is beautiful. He says it is too much. And he says he misses the sound of the forest." Marcus looked at him, understanding all too well. Civilization was dazzling, yes, but it was relentless too. And for someone who had lived his entire life in silence and simplicity, it was a storm of sensation and strangeness. That night, Marcus thought of Pyotr, Galina, Anya, and Vera still in their cabin, living by firelight, their world untouched by all this chaos. He wondered if they sat by the hearth and spoke of Mikhail, if Galina looked at the empty space where her son had slept and imagined him in this overwhelming new world. He promised himself then that he would help Mikhail find his footing, that he would not abandon him to face this strange future alone. And yet, even as he vowed it, Marcus could not shake the feeling that in bridging these two worlds, one carved from silence and survival, the other roaring with modernity and noise, They had altered something forever. Some part of that untouched wilderness now belonged to the past, its secret no longer hidden. Still, as he looked at Mikhail staring up at the glowing electric lights of the town, his expression alight with wonder, Marcus knew there was no turning back. The boy's future lay ahead, vast and uncharted, as boundless as the sky he had only just discovered. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out our other videos and share this one with someone who would love it too.